Climate change. That thing you've been ignoring because it only affects places like Bangladesh. But Americans don't care about Bangladesh. We don't even care about Puerto Rico. That's supposed to be America. But what if I told you you don't have to care about those places? I mean, you don't have to care about them in the context of climate change. Look, climate change is going to affect you where you live in America. But the way we talk about climate change is deeply flawed. Nobody cares about what's going to happen in 2100 because they won't live that long. So let's just talk about the next 30 years in 6 different regions using only middle-of-the-road estimates and see where that takes us. Wait, why 30 years?
Because according to the IPCC, we're likely to exceed 1.5 degrees of warming in the early 2030s, with the World Meteorological Organization stating the chances of temporarily exceeding 1.5 degrees of warming has steadily risen since 2015, when it was close to 0. Now it's 66%, and we'll probably hit 2 degrees of warming by 2050.
What kind of effects can the South and the Gulf Coast expect by 2050?
For starters, the region is expected to see 10.9 to 14.4 inches in relative sea level rise, which is the local increase in sea level.
According to a combined effort of NASA, NOAA, Army Corps of Engineers, and Rihanna's Navy.
Mahalo, motherfucker.
And the thing about ocean waves is that when they touch our stuff, that's bad. Important infrastructure erodes and corrodes in these conditions. Stuff like bridges, buildings, roads, and nuclear power plants. All right, stop. I can hear you typing. I watched that Kyrgyzstan video too about nuclear power. You're right. So let's take a deep breath and slow down. Okay, this is Turkey Point Nuclear Power Plant located south of Miami.
It's the 11th largest power plant of any kind in the country, and last year it generated 20 million megawatt hours of electricity from 2 different reactors and a natural gas generator,
which is roughly the equivalent of 1.6 million homes. So it's a pretty important piece of infrastructure.
The reactors are cooled by a series of canals that are 5 miles long and 2 miles across, and they act as a giant radiator to cool the reactors, which is a feature unique to Turkey Point.
The thing is, Florida is basically all limestone and sand, and canals are pretty bad at keeping the water in, which we'll get back to, and keeping water out. If we look at this map, I know what you're probably thinking. Oh no, the water will be underwater.
After the Fukushima disaster, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which regulates the nuclear industry, ordered a review of flood risks at reactor sites, including the effects of climate change.
At Turkey Point, that was estimated to be about 1/3 of a foot by 2033, which is a reasonable estimate.
By 2018, when Florida Power and Light, the operators of the plant, went to renew the license for Turkey Point to keep it operating until 2053, they made no mention of sea level rise at all.
But it actually gets better, because Florida Power and Light applied to create 2 new reactors at this same location,
which was also approved in 2018. This time they did include an estimate for sea level rise. It says 1 foot by 2100, not 2050, lower than NOAA's lowest possible estimate of 16.2 inches at Virginia Key.
In October of 2019, the NRC put out
a generic environmental impact study in response to the license renewal.
It's a fun read. When I read it, I was surprised to find that the October 2019 EIS says 2 different projections of sea level rise are not directly comparable, and then compares them in the very next sentence, and then cites the wrong sea level rise estimate. Yep, that's right. They say that relative sea level rise on the east and Gulf Coast of the United States is likely to be higher than the global average, and then only cite the global average while comparing it to local planning estimates, which they dismiss as overly conservative. Their preferred estimate was between 6 to 14.4 inches by 2050. The actual local estimate from their source, using the nearest tidal gauge from the data set at Virginia Key, was between 6.5 and 20.2 inches. We now have a much more accurate number from NOAA of 7.9 inches to 16.5 inches at Virginia Key. What's my point? My point is, despite earlier in the report saying they understood the difference between regional relative sea level rise and global average sea level rise, they underestimated sea level rise here by 40% because they used the wrong number. I'm sure they updated their projections to the 2022 numbers I've been citing this whole time. Well, if you thought that, you'd be wrong.
Because in 2023, when the Biden administration put out a new rule requiring climate change to be made part of these environmental impact studies, the NRC staff wrote, "There have been no updates to the climate change reports from the US GRCP and NOAA since the publication of the EIS."
This EIS document, with all the mistakes before, is what they're referring to. This is obviously false. There have been updates.
NOAA updated its projections in 2022. They are part of the draft National Climate Assessment.
That was publicly available when NRC staff wrote that. If the New York Times had access to it, so did NRC staff. Why is a guy with 0 subscribers talking about this and nobody else? I don't f***ing know. Look, I'm sure this is just a particular plant with these problems. Oh.
19 nuclear plants face 3 or more flood risks they weren't designed for because of climate change. Maybe the commission will require mandatory drills and equipment based on these flood risks. See, it says Flexibility Mitigation Program, or FLEX program, for storing generators, pumps, and other equipment on site in concrete bunkers. And that operators don't have to upgrade equipment to deal with the higher levels of flooding. They also don't have to run drills with that equipment.
That's the power of the free market, baby. Now watch this drive. Kobe. Look, I think nuclear power is really important for the transition away from fossil fuels. It dramatically reduces the amount of grid energy storage we would need otherwise, and the newer, safer, cheaper Gen 3 reactors are being rolled out now. The crazy thing is, the biggest problem facing the nuclear industry is public perception of safety. If you give the public the perception that you aren't evaluating risk properly, that's bad for the industry's long-term health. Obviously, these plants with increased climate-related flood risks need site-specific flood evaluations with real, accurate consensus numbers. I'm not saying all of this because I think an accident will happen, but because otherwise, it might leave us with nuclear plants that are effectively stranded assets politically. Wait, didn't I say something about the canals not being able to keep the water in?
And canals are pretty bad at keeping the water in, which we'll get back to.
Yeah, looks like I did.
The canals experience evaporation like any other body of water. So the water in them makes them more salty as it evaporates. It rains, but not enough to make up for the evaporation. Since the canals are unlined and they're porous, salty water can then flow out. As the salty water flows out, it interacts with the Biscayne aquifer and impacts the water quality of the aquifer. We know this because regulatory agencies have been monitoring tritium levels in the groundwater, showing that the saltier water comes from Turkey Point.
But why have they been worried about this? Well, because nearly all of Miami's water supply comes from the Biscayne aquifer. It's in a teensy bit of trouble.
As sea level rises, the ocean water pushes against the fresh water of the aquifer. If, for instance, South Florida, say, drained large amounts of swampland and diverted natural flows of the Everglades that recharge the aquifer, and then say there were several Superfund sites near the wells that supply Miami with its water, and then say there were a bunch of septic tanks with doo-doo in them that were made with lower groundwater levels in mind,
then adding sea level rise to that equation would not help. And then adding a saltwater plume from Turkey Point would also not help.
The estimated cost of addressing Miami-Dade County's water supply issues is $13.5 billion. The county's budget is $10.4 billion. I'm sure Miami is the only place dealing with this.
Oh wait, pretty much any coastal city that relies upon groundwater would have a similar situation, minus maybe the limestone.
Even cities with water intakes in rivers near oceans could see those intakes threatened by seawater moving upstream as sea levels rise.
The state of Florida and the federal government could do things like
The Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan, which could greatly increase the recharge rate of the Biscayne aquifer and help slow intrusion of saltwater. But the project remains unfunded despite Congress passing the plan into law in 2000.
But at least the city of Miami has valuable oceanfront property it can tax to raise all of this money. I mean, aside from the parts that it will be flooded by seawater. I mean, it's not like those values would plummet due to some free market force prior to the flooding, right? Those homeowners, and more importantly, investors, will always have insurance in the event of some sort of natural disaster, like maybe a hurricane. Well, I got some good news and I got some bad news. The good news is they do have insurance. The bad news is no matter where in the US you live, you will eventually be paying the bill. Let me back up a bit.
In 2022, Hurricane Ian caused $112 billion in damage, the second largest insured loss on record, behind only Hurricane Katrina. But that just capped off a string of years starting in 2016, where the Florida insurance industry as a whole posted a net loss.
So what? Well, eventually when a for-profit company loses money, they stop doing that thing that's losing them money, and they start doing things to try and stop losing that money.
Things like dropping all the customers and leaving the state, or becoming insolvent and filing for bankruptcy.
But channeling the spirit of Adam Smith himself, the Florida Republican Party, which has controlled the Florida State House since 1999, foresaw this issue in 2002, and by holding a seance with Ronald Reagan's ghost, they decided on the only capitalist free market solution possible.
They made a state-owned enterprise called Citizens Property Insurance Corporation.
To be fair, this only combined two existing state-owned insurance companies into one insurance company of last resort. I just find it funny that when capitalism stopped being convenient for the Republican Party, they made a state-owned enterprise to solve their problem. But Florida is hardly alone in this decision. Other communist-infiltrated state houses like Texas and Louisiana have also read and understood Marx when Marx wrote, "Socialism is when homeowners insurance of last resort." So why does this matter, and why will I be paying for it if I don't live in Florida?
It matters because industry analysts have noted that about half the companies offering policies in Florida are in financial trouble, and that currently Citizens has an overall market share of 13%. But in places like Miami, that share is currently 30% and growing.
And you'll be paying for it because Florida is historically considered a swing state and is the third largest state by population. Ooh, it's the ghost of AIG looking for a bailout. I'm sure things are going better in other states. Look, I've been a little negative up to this point. How about enjoying some of Florida's natural beauty and wildlife? Maybe a little feel-good story about how companies can make a positive change in their communities. I'm here in Tampa, Florida, where you can see TECO, the local power company, has graciously built a manatee viewing center, free to the public. There's educational material, live animal demonstrations with stingrays, even though they killed Steve Irwin, and beautiful scenic views. What the fuck is that? Oh, that? Well, that's TECO-owned and operated Big Bend power plant. And those smokestacks behind me are for a coal-fired portion of the power plant. Yes, on the bay. Yes, by the manatees. Yes, coal ash is an extremely toxic byproduct of the coal burning process.
The coal byproducts called bottom ash and fly ash need to be stored somewhere on site in what are called coal ash ponds. These ash ponds contain contaminants like arsenic. Arsenic levels in the monitoring wells nearest to the Manatee Viewing Center exceeded maximum contaminant levels set by the EPA 22 out of 23 times between 2010 and 2019.
So the manatee viewing area that's set up to watch the manatees that are attracted to the warm water discharge from this plant is also probably exposing the manatees to much higher levels of arsenic than is naturally occurring. I would say poisoning them, but I couldn't find any peer-reviewed science on poisoning manatees, and now I'm on a government watch list. Here's a map of all the locations of these ponds.
The red dots are unlined ponds, meaning it's just a big hole in the ground where they dumped coal ash.
Why, yes, some of these are on the coast. And yes, some of them are at risk of flooding due to climate change. And yes, it will affect people's drinking water. Obviously, I chose a ridiculous example here, but the point stands. This is the kind of poorly thought out infrastructure and environmental policy that is going to honestly bite rural communities in the ass. These sites need to be remediated or relocated before it does this harm. At least there are other parts of the South that are located inland and don't have to deal with this stuff. Like Atlanta, too far inland to be affected by sea level rise. Occasionally a hurricane, but not like Florida. Maybe that's the solution. Everybody just moves to Atlanta. I mean, it's basically what's already happening.
Between 2000 and 2020, the Atlanta area grew from roughly 4 million people to 6 million people, a 50% increase.
So ignoring the strain something like that puts on things like housing and social problems, problem solved. Well, maybe there's just one more thing I may have forgotten.
From 2006 to 2008, the South experienced a large-scale drought. In Atlanta, like many other inland southern cities, most of the water comes from surface sources, lakes and rivers.
Atlanta doesn't have an aquifer anywhere near large enough to meet its water needs.
So they dammed up the Chattahoochee River and made Lake Lanier. Roughly 70% of Atlanta's water comes from Lake Lanier and the Chattahoochee River. In 2008, the city reached a point where it only had 90 days of water left.
Due to the drought. After the drought, the Metropolitan North Georgia Water Planning District, mouthful,
which manages the area's water infrastructure, oversaw a reduction of per capita water usage of 30%.
So again, problem solved. Well, you see, I said per capita, and what matters is total.
In 2009, the district used an average of 512 million gallons per day. In 2019, the district used an average of 559 millions per day.
So 559 million divided by 512 million gives us a 9% increase.
But to be fair, the city of Atlanta only uses 89.6 million gallons of water per day, and it's constructed a 2.4
billion gallon reservoir
in a former rock quarry officials say could give Atlanta between 30 and 90 days of water.
So we're good. Well, not so fast. If you divide 2.4 billion by 89.6 million, you get 26.7 days of water. It's not like the water is just going to farms like out west.
53% of the water goes to single and multifamily use.
And there are two more little wrinkles here.
First, the district projects the area will see a 40% increase in water usage by 2040.
A 40% increase of 89.6 million is $125,440,000. If we divide 2.4 billion by that number, we get $19.1 days of water. So the Quarry project, which cost $320 million, only buys Atlanta 19 days of water instead of 30 by 2040.
We did it. We did it, Joe.
The other wrinkle is that droughts are expected to last longer and become more severe in the region over that same period of time.
So if water demand grows with expected population, there's no major water source to be used or to be built with current planning. And if another drought like 2008 were to occur, then Atlanta would still end up in a worse position in terms of water supply than 2008, despite the water management improvements. I'm not saying Atlanta's going to run out of water. I'm saying that when you plan infrastructure 20 years ahead, you got to consider whether or not your development pattern is sustainable. Maybe saying Atlanta's water future is secure or that we have water for the next 100 years is bad when it's not true. If all of this feels a bit overwhelming and it leads you to a sense of doomerism, I think that's understandable. But it's not because this problem is impossible to solve. It feels that way because America's politics feels like an immovable status quo. But ask yourself, why is it immovable? Because government can't serve money and people at the same time. This is fundamentally a political problem, and when something's unsustainable, by definition, it must stop eventually. And that's exactly what this climate policy status quo is. Unsustainable. If you like this video, please show it to somebody you think will like it. And I'd like to cover other stories. My channel's not just about climate change. It's about a lot of different things. So subscribe.
In our gift shop, you'll find unique gifts and educational items for the whole family. If you have questions during your visit, our staff of retired Tampa Electric team members and volunteer docents will be happy to help.
No DMCA, la 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 la, no DMCA, no DMCA, la 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 la.